Welcome to The General and the Journalist, a podcast about how the global order's breaking down, conflicts on the rise, and the world's getting ever more dangerous.
And we're here every week to try and explain it all. And the general part of the equation, Patrick, is you, Sir Patrick Sanders.
And you're the journalist half, Tom Newton-Dunn.
So how are you, Patrick?
I'm feeling pretty buoyed up, actually. Lots of feedback on the podcast. The bit that really caught my eye is this impression that we seem to be giving that we actually like each other. And if only they knew the truth.
Heaven forbid. We'll have to see what we can do to dissuade people of that. And also, we're getting lots of listeners, which is wonderful. So a great thank you to everyone who's tuning in and downloading. So it's been a busy old week, hasn't it? Let's return to Ukraine this week and a particularly fascinating story. Now, there aren't many who haven't heard of Operation Spider's Web, that brilliant Ukrainian surprise attack by drones on Russian air bases deep inside Russia, taking out up to 22 strategic Russian bombers. A brilliant secret operation. But today we're going to talk about an even more secret side of the war, and one that's been carried out even more in the shadows, if you like. And it appears to be Ukraine's secret assassinations of key Russian figures inside Russia itself.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And there's also a key distinction: assassination or targeted killings. And we're going to come back to that. So war, of course, is governed by a strict set of rules, what is permissible and what is not permissible in warfare. And we'll be talking about that in detail today. And it's fair to say that some of these killings have been pretty bold.
They certainly have. And that's a fascinating discussion itself, isn't it? Where do you draw the line? So, Patrick, can we start by me telling a story?
I'm all ears, Tom.
It's a absolutely intriguing one, galling one as well at the same time. And it's really at the heart of what we're trying to discuss today. It's about a gentleman by the name of Zaur Gerstiev. Now, he's a 34-year-old major in the Russian Air Force, recently retired about a year ago. And he left the armed forces to become mayor of his local town, Stavropol. And that's a well-established tradition by the Kremlin. They like to take what they see as war heroes and they put them into politics as a reward. It's actually got a name. It's called the Time of Heroes program. So that's what happened to Gerstiev. Now, Gerstiev was decorated for bravery, for leading the airstrikes on a fairly notorious action at the start of the war, known as the Siege of Marupole, an action which Ukraine has called a war crime, and they're demanding justice for.
Yeah, let's just remind ourselves about how horrific these attacks were. So around 20,000 civilians, according to President Zelensky, are thought to have died during the Mariupol bombings in the spring of 2022. And during that onslaught, a theatre was bombed where civilians, which included children, were seeking shelter. And the word deti, which is Russian for children, had been written really clearly outside the theatre to prevent an attack, and that obviously didn't work.
I think people remember that very powerfully from their TV screens at the time. So back to Gerstiev, who is wanted for war crimes, certainly by the Ukrainians anyway. He was killed in a bomb blast 2 weeks ago outside a block of flats. Now, his killing was captured on security CCTV footage, as so much is these days. So we know what happened. He was seen meeting another man. He walks up to this other man, and a few seconds later, something appears to explode in the other man's bag, and it kills both of them.
And this happened in Stavropol. Give us a sense of how far that is from the front line, Tom.
Well, it's far away. So it's about 300 miles from the Ukrainian border, and that in itself is about another 100 miles on from the front line. So this is 400 miles away from the action, London to Edinburgh, I guess. So Gerstiev, and we now get into the realms of some unconfirmed reporting, albeit intriguing all the same. It appears this was some sort of honey trap. So Gerstiev appears to have met the other man on a dating site. This other man we know was a 29-year-old local man. So it looks like that might have been why they were meeting. But here's the most extraordinary part of the story. It was believed at first to be suicide bombing. But further subsequent reports from a Russian Telegram channel called VCheck OGPU, and it's quite a well-known Telegram channel, this, and it's independent journalism, very critical of the Russian state, the Russian intelligence services. And they reported that the local man was hired by someone to gather compromising material on Gerstiev. So he had a video and recording equipment, listening equipment in his bag. But this local man who was hired by someone had no idea that his bag actually contained a bomb. So the device was detonated remotely, killing them both instantly, and the guy wasn't a suicide bomber at all.
So not a suicide bombing, he's a proxy.
That is what has been reported. Again, we just don't know because no one has yet popped up to tell us the truth. So the huge question, of course, is who did it? The Russian authorities, unsurprisingly, pointing their fingers blame at Ukraine. Ukraine is not confirming or denying any involvement in all.
Well, it's certainly an intriguing story, and it begs a lot of questions, not least because it's one of a number of apparent targeted killing attempts in the last year, which have been blamed on Ukraine by the Russians.
And that's it. It looks very much to be a new front in Ukraine's war against Russia. So if David can't beat Goliath on the battlefield, and we know they're struggling with that, they're doing it by asymmetric warfare. In other words, Operation Spider's Web, the brilliant drone attack, trying to blow up the Kerch Bridge again. We saw that also last week. And these taking out very important Russian figures in their own backyard. And Gertsev was far from the first. So General Igor Krillov, he seems to be the first of this. Now, he headed Russia's military biological and chemical weapons unit. He was killed alongside his deputy as they were both walking out of their block of flats in December last year. They walked by a scooter, about to get into their own car. The scooter was packed with explosives, blew up and killed them both. Kremlin says,
No one else injured?
No one else injured. Very careful
So
operation.
quite precise.
Precise,
Yeah.
just the two of them. Kremlin has said it's a terrorist attack. Ukrainians, interestingly, on this one, did actually admit responsibility. They were quite happy to claim Krillov as theirs. Another one, in April this year, Lieutenant General Yaroslav Moskalik. Now, Moskalik was the deputy head of the main operational directorate of the military's general staff, so a very senior planner in the Russian defense establishment. And in April, a car bomb inside a Volkswagen Golf, and you might remember the CCTV footage as well because it was all over the TV screens, blew up just outside his block of flats as he was walking right up to this Volkswagen Golf in the town of Balakshika in central Russia. So Russians again blamed Ukraine, this time again, no mission of responsibility.
So different to the last one. No claim of responsibility as there was for Kirillov.
That's it.
Yeah. And then, of course, there have been not just military, but there have been some civilians too. So we had Mikail Shatsky, who was the deputy general designer of Russia's Mars Design Bureau. So that's a Russian weapons expert. He was involved in modernizing cruise missiles that, of course, have been attacking and launched against Kyiv fairly continuously. And he was shot dead in Kuzminsky Park in December of last year, about 12 miles from the Kremlin, by a killer who fled the scene.
So all in a very bloody new chapter in this war. Is that your take on these targeting killings too, to begin with, Patrick, your first reactions?
Well, it's obviously a story that holds fascination for people. I mean, these are unconventional, clandestine, daring operations behind enemy lines. And we give these sort of operations lots of labels. We talk about shadow war. We use the word assassination. We'll come back to that. We talk about partisans, guerrillas, terrorism, if you're a Russian. But in the military, we'd call this targeting. We wouldn't call it assassination. And I think we're going to see more of these targeted killings in the months to come. Why? Because war is not confined just to the battlefield. And Ukraine knows that if it tries to pit numerically weaker armed forces of Ukraine forces against much, much stronger Russian forces, it's the short road to defeat. So they're fighting smart, not stupid. And we would do the same.
Should we just unpack the difference here between targeted killings and assassinations? Because it may be just linguistics, but you think there's an important difference and we need to define them.
I think this is really important. Now, it's clear that there isn't, I mean, there is some disagreement on the difference, but an assassination is defined by legal scholars as a murder for political purposes. So another way of thinking about this is an unlawful killing by the state. So the language that I would use is targeted killing. And Human Rights Watch explains that a targeted killing in an armed conflict refers to a deliberate, lethal attack by government forces against a specific individual not in custody. In other words, it's entirely lawful, and killing enemy combatants or anyone engaged in armed conflict or terrorism is part of our job spec.
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because I'm sure you're right on the law. In fact, that was your job for 40 years to know what the military law was or as it applied to what you did. But here's the thing. If Ukraine killed Vladimir Putin, the entire world, including the Times and possibly even this podcast, would say Ukraine assassinated Vladimir Putin. And that would appear to have nothing illegal to it whatsoever.
No, you might use that language, you might say that, but for me, assassinations are illegal. So that would be high-value targeting. So if Ukraine killed Putin, they would only do that if it was a lawful killing.
And arguably, it could be a lawful killing. You
Absolutely.
could very much make the case for that in the ICC, in the International Criminal Court.
Yes, but if an assassination is an unlawful killing by a state, then it wouldn't be lawful.
Okay, all right. It may be a little bit about linguistics, and maybe the journalistic use of the word assassination.
I don't like the word assassination. These are lawful killings. That's the only way you refer to targeting.
Okay, well, let's unpack this very shadowy war a bit more then, shall we, to get a clearer picture of it. And there's a few questions we're going to ask, isn't there?
Yeah, so first of all, who was behind these operations? Secondly, what's the purpose of these missions and how effective are they? And then thirdly, let's think about the factors that get considered when we plan and mount them. And those are the legal and the ethical and the operational concerns.
Okay, well, let's start with the who then, if indeed Ukraine is behind these, which we very much obviously suspect. Now, we don't know because Ukraine hasn't claimed responsibility for most of these, we should say, but there's a few things we do know, aren't there? I mean, Ukrainian politicians have been quite quick to state precisely what the country's intent is. So Colonel Roman Kostenko, a Ukrainian MP, former member of Ukraine's Special Forces, said this pretty recently. These people will be punished wherever they are. They'll be afraid not only to leave the territory of the Russian Federation, but to leave their houses. So if it is Ukraine, Patrick, which Ukrainians are doing it?
Well, there are two Ukrainian intelligence agencies that are capable and indeed charged with mounting these sort of operations. So the first is the SBU, that's the State Security Service of Ukraine. It's a state security and intelligence agency, and it's tasked with counterintelligence, counterterrorism, cyber defense, and internal security operations. But it also carries out offensive, covert, and clandestine operations, including sabotage and drone strikes deep within Russian territory. So these, this is the organization that led the famous Operation Spiderweb that we mentioned last week. So this is targeting the Russian air bases and damaging over 40 aircraft. And they also oversaw the development and deployment of the Sea Baby marine drones, which have been striking Russian naval assets in the Black Sea.
So I guess a cross between RMI5, MI6 all rolled into one.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it.
Okay, and the second Ukrainian intelligence agency we think are doing these operations is something called the HUR, not to be confused with the SBU. And the HUR is basically the military intelligence service, and it stands for the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, slightly less catchy name perhaps. So their military intelligence run and operated and answering to the Ministry of Defense, and they're largely responsible for collecting, analysing intelligence on the battlefield and delivering strategic opportunities to the generals and the politicians. They also fly drone attacks behind enemy lines, and some quite impressive ones recently as well. They struck an oil terminal near St. Petersburg. They blew up a gunpowder factory in the Berdyansk region as well. And in January, HUR agents embedded bombs, tiny little bombs, inside virtual reality head masks to be used by Russian drone pilots, which then exploded when the Russian pilots put them on and caused them a lot of obviously quite serious injuries. An echo really of Mossad's exploding pages, which took out hundreds of Hezbollah commanders last year, we all remember quite well. But the SBU and the HUR, they're run quite differently, aren't they? It's not really a network we understand.
No, so as you said, the SBU reports directly to the president. It's a very large force. It's got around 30,000 operatives. It did in 2021, and that makes it actually the largest security agency in Europe. The HUR, on the other hand, as you say, it reports directly to the Minister of Defense, so not to the president. And like lots of intelligence agencies around the world, there is some rivalry between the two of them, and it's at times it's pretty intense between these two, much like the decades-old competition that we see sometimes bursting out between the FBI and the CIA in the US. But unlike Western intelligence agencies, so think MI5 and MI6, these are not tightly regulated in the way that ours are. They're not tightly controlled. They're not really scrutinized. And that's in part because Ukraine is still quite a young fledgling democracy, but also critically because it's in wartime. And what that means is that the power isn't so much held by the institution as by the individuals who head them up.
Really interesting. Well, that's a great segue into the individuals, because the two different people who run the HUR and the SBU are both themselves fascinating characters, quite mythical now in Ukraine. They're really hero worshipped and household names. they're not what you might call Ponties. Now, I'm so sorry to interrupt this podcast with my own military acronym to try and military slang to try and puzzle you with, Patrick, but I finally dug one up. You founding the hole in my knowledge for the last sort of 2 or 3 weeks. So do you know what a Ponty is?
I do actually, Tom.
Oh God, how disappointing. Go on then.
I have a long book of acronyms, sadly. Ponty is a person of no tactical importance. So kind of what I was as the head of the army.
Correct. That's infuriating. In fact, it was described to me by a former regimental sergeant major, a friend of mine, who said that's exactly what we used to call the officers. But you, as a general, you're not just a Ponty, you're a super Ponty.
I was a mega Ponty. Yeah.
A mega Ponty. All right. Well, look, back to the script here. The two very much non-Ponties, real key players who run the HUR and the SBU. Should we start with the HUR? So that's run by a chap called Major General Krillov Budenov, a hugely mythical worshipped character in Ukraine. And you've met him personally, Patrick.
Yeah, I have. I mean, he's formidable. He's got many of the qualities that you would want from a wartime leader of a military intelligence agency. He's devious, cunning, bold, risk-taking, I mean, almost to extremes, very creative, and as you say, sort of quite good at myth-making. And there's a great quote by Churchill about what you need from wartime commanders. And the language he uses is, you're looking for an element of legerdemain, an original and sinister touch, which leaves the enemy puzzled as well as beaten. And I think that Budenov is very good at that. But, and there is a but, he's also extremely ambitious personally. And that means that there are some in Ukraine who see him as a potential political threat to Zelensky. So there are question marks about how much he is trusted. And it might also be why we're hearing much more about the SBU in the news than we are about the HUR.
Very interesting. Maybe why SBU were given the Operation Spider's Web job rather than the HUR. One could debate. Some other facts and figures about Budenov that I found really interesting. And it's part of this perhaps myth that he maybe likes to culture himself. So he operates in almost entire darkness. So his office windows are pretty much bricked up or sandbagged up. No natural light ever comes in. Inside are lots of banners of Ukraine and sort of patriotic symbols. He's survived at least 10 different assassination attempts that we know of. He's taken part in secret missions himself, and as the rank of Major General, that's fairly rare, including in occupied Crimea, where he stepped on or came very close to an anti-personnel mine and took a load of shrapnel wounds in his chest. He's still got some pretty big scars there to prove it. He's broken both his neck. He's been shot in the arm. So all in all, quite a character.
Do they call him Lucky?
I bet they do. So who runs the SBU then? The MI5, MI6 equivalent, the civilian servers, if you like. It's a chap called Vasil Maluk.
Yeah, and described to me by a number of people as a bear of a man.
And have you ever come across a Ukrainian military or intelligence leader who hasn't been described as a bear of a man? It is the absolute moniker
I think it
du jour.
I think it goes with the territory. If you're a Ukrainian wartime leader, you're definitely a bear of a man. So he's also clearly very bold, cunning and determined. But he's also quite sensitive. He's very thoughtful, and he feels his responsibilities really deeply. He's also seen as deeply loyal, and he was the architect of Operation Spider's Web. So what we're seeing is a strong element of competition and some professional jealousy, both between the individuals and the agencies. We probably shouldn't read too much in it. It goes with the territory. It was true of a multitude of military intelligence agencies that were set up by Churchill, including the Special Operations Executive, the SOE. It's been true of MI5 and MI6 and GCHQ in the past, though I would say not now. And it remains true of the US intelligence community.
And I guess another interesting point about both the HUR and the SBU doing these sort of operations is Ukrainians find it a lot easier to operate covertly inside Russia than Russians do inside Ukraine. And one major reason that is the language. A lot of Ukrainians speak Russian. They grew up with it. They had to when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. They wanted to learn it in school. For some of them, it's even their mother tongue for those in eastern Ukraine. So they blend in a lot easier. Many have relatives, friends in Russia who can hide them, support them, etc. And Budenov himself has also claimed that his agents, his network is getting a lot of help from Russian anti-Putin networks inside Russia itself. An interesting claim, as yet not to be proved.
And they're using unsuspecting proxies, as they apparently did with Operation Spider's Web. So Russians who simply don't know that they're part of an operation. So why don't we turn from the who to the why? Why do these operations happen? And I think we should start with your perspective, Tom, which is more the political angle.
Yeah, and I think the reasons why these politicians order these operations, as they almost always are, they have to have political authority for these sorts of things, as they would in the UK if we did these sorts of things. There's a lot of politics going on here. So a really important reason why these things happen is simply revenge. So it's a national desire from the voters, from the electorate, from the people of Ukraine to see revenge, to see some what they see as horrific war crimes avenged. And this has happened down the years, for decades, if not hundreds of years, different countries wanting to do this. Vasil Maluk himself, the head of the SBU, said, "The position of the security service is clear and unambiguous. Every crime of the aggressor must be punished." So, historic comparison, the US killing of Osama bin Laden, you could argue, in 2011, 10 years after the 9/11 attacks. But they got him, as Obama
They did,
said
but
at the
they
time.
also said that he represented an ongoing threat.
Which is a point that you'll come on to. Second reason why these things happen, that they go after these sort of high-value targets, is the PR value. So they have great effects on the country's morale because they like to see these sort of things avenged. But Ukrainians, it puts a bit of spirit back into them after an incredibly hard 3 years. And also there's the international impact as well. We talk about them on podcasts. We come close to lionising them. It's not really what we're trying to do here, but they are very, very impressive, well-executed military operations. And that makes Ukraine look bigger. And people like Donald Trump sit up. And maybe it just might persuade the President of the United States to think, actually, you know what? There's some fight left in these guys and they aren't quite beaten after all.
Yeah. I mean, I get the emotions behind this. You're talking about things like revenge and justice. And those are all political motivations. But as a soldier, it's incredibly important to all of us that what we're doing is legitimate, is lawful, is ethical, has a moral grounding to it. So what matters to me is the legitimacy of these actions, the legality, and that we do through a process. So you may talk about justice and revenge. All I want to talk about is military necessity. This isn't revenge or PR, but it's all about the practical gain that you get from such operations. And, you talked about Osama bin Laden, but actually, the US line on this was not so much a revenge, but it was about the fact that he was continuing to plot attacks against the US and friends and allies. So he was a current threat. It wasn't about revenge.
So that takes us to, I guess, the third reason why these things happen, why Ukraine might be carrying out these sort of targeted killings. And that's the practical military effect, isn't it, Patrick?
Well, clearly, losing key players, high-value targets, as we would describe them, is going to weaken the enemy. And what we're really trying to do with these operations, when we talk about them generally, is first of all an effect that we call disruption. So that is breaking apart and undermining the enemy's will, so its will to fight, but also its cohesion, the sort of glue that holds it together. It's fundamentally about degrading their ability to wage war. You might also do it as a preemptive action to preempt or prevent an enemy operation or some sort of military advantage that might be gained. It's a great example of that. So Ahmed Shah Massoud, the Lion of Panjshir, was memorably killed by a Taliban suicide bomber 2 days before 9/11. That's a clear case of preemption.
And he was, of course, the great leader of the Afghan resistance, the Northern Alliance, against the Taliban for many, many years.
Exactly. And then, as you kind of touched on, this is about wearing down their morale. I mean, on the battlefield, having a sniper operating against you is incredibly wearing. This is sort of the same thing, but in the enemy's depth. And it complicates other military leaders' daily lives. The predictability is exhausting. It's wearing. It's unsettling. It undermines morale. No one knows who's next.
And there's a comparison here with the Troubles, isn't there, with the bitter conflict in Northern Ireland for 30 years, fought by the IRA against largely British security forces. And that's in no way to legitimise what the IRA are doing or in any way to equate them with Ukraine's legitimate struggle for freedom and independence. But the IRA in the 1980s started going after targets on the UK mainland and military officers at their homes in Northern Ireland, all over the UK, politicians too. And, I remember my father was a member of the European Parliament in the 1980s, and I remember him one day coming back saying, well, I've just had this rather alarming letter saying I need to start looking into my car every morning before I take you to school. And I was about sort of 8 or 9 years old, and I was somewhat horrified by this. I'd have to say, an MEP would be very low down the IRA's target list at the time. I think he probably forgot after sort of 2 or 3 days this. But you were a military officer, Thraz. You've served in Northern Ireland. This would have been something that would have affected you personally as well.
Yeah, and as you say, and it's important to make, you made the point, but Northern Ireland was an internal disturbance. It wasn't legally an armed or international armed conflict. But nevertheless, the effect is the same in terms of it being wearing, and it became muscle memory to check under your car. So it was just something that you did all the time. What was really alarming when I was based there, and I had a wife and a young child, a baby, my son, and my wife would go out shopping in Tesco's in Belfast, and she would have to check under the family car, in a public car park, trying to put a baby next to the car while she was checking for a bomb. And it's just something that you got used to, but it was wearing.
It was a mental drain. It slowed down your daily life. You'd have to take different routes driving to work as well. Yeah. It was, to use a precise military term, an embuggeration, you can say. Okay, and I think it's also worth pointing out the psychological effect that all these assassinations, targeted killings, as you prefer to call them, have on Vladimir Putin himself. It makes him feel very vulnerable, and it infuriates him. And we know this because he's said this publicly. And when Krillov was killed, his general in Moscow, he publicly told off the FSB, Russia's internal security service, to say, this was a failing. You will not let this ever happen again.
So this is clearly having an effect in Russia. Why haven't the Russians been trying to do the same thing in Ukraine, Tom?
Well, we think they have. We just think they've been a lot less successful. So if you think back to the very early few months of the war, it was repeatedly reported that the Russians were trying to kill President Zelensky. Remember, their troops were on the outskirts of Kyiv, northern Kyiv, and they were sending in Spetsnaz, special forces soldiers undercover to try and find Zelensky and kill him. They failed to do that. Or quite frankly, they failed to kill any senior member of the Ukrainian government or military. We know of none at all who've been assassinated by the Russians, when there's lots on the Ukrainian side. I think the reason for that is a lot harder for the Russians to operate in Ukraine, as we discussed. Ukrainians, a lot of them speak Russian. Russians never bothered to learn Ukrainian. And they don't know the country like Ukrainians know Russians. It has to be said that Russia is doing better abroad, though, finding and killing defectors. And Russia, President Putin, is a real thing with defectors. We saw that with Skripal, the former MI6 agent, who they tried to kill, obviously, with Novichok in Salisbury. Maxim Kazimov, a former Russian helicopter pilot who defected a couple of years ago. He flew his giant Mi-8 transport helicopter over the border, landed in Ukraine, and gave this great big valuable piece of equipment to the Ukrainians. Infuriated the Kremlin. So he was tracked down, we believe, by the GRU, Russia's military intelligence service, shot dead and then run over by his own car just outside the basement garage in a little Spanish coastal town where he was living. I guess you could say, pour encourager les autres is Putin's mantra, to encourage the others. Do you know the origin of that phrase, by the way?
I'm sorry, I'm just enjoying your French, Tom. I do, but I'm not going to spoil it for you by saying, go on. I know you've done a lot of research. Tell us where it's from.
At least 3 minutes on Wikipedia and Google. Well, I always thought it was Napoleon, and he was obviously a very brutal general and liked to punish people by strapping to cannon mouths and that sort of thing.
Let's not lose our French listeners, Tom. He was a great man.
Okay, right. Well, let's get back to Napoleon on another podcast, perhaps. Actually, it was Voltaire, the great French writer, Voltaire's Candide, written in 1759. And it was actually about the execution of Admiral John Byng, a famous Royal Navy admiral who was executed by the Admiralty for failing to retake Minorca, the Battle of Minorca in 1756.
Quite right.
Good, and of course you knew all that. I actually think I should talk to myself in these podcasts. It's more informative for me anyway. So Russian targeted killing operations, they're more successful abroad, they're not successful in Ukraine, but they're definitely becoming more sinister. And this is a really alarming development of late. For example, the alleged Russian plot last year to murder the chief executive of a company called Rheinmetall, which is Germany's biggest arms manufacturer, and others, a chap called Armin Papager, other arms manufacturers as well, civilians. These were fooled by US counterintelligence who tipped off the Germans, and the Germans put a lot of security around Papager. But they'd still have to do this. I mean, I think you just need to look at Valery Zaluzny, the former head of Ukraine's armed forces, now the Ukraine ambassador to London. If you've been to their embassy, if you've seen him out about, as I have, I'm sure you have too, the security around him is extraordinary.
Okay, so the reason we're talking about all this is there are some that question the legality and the legitimacy of targeted killings. there are some, particularly in Washington at the moment, who worry not about the legitimacy, but they worry much more about Ukraine's boldness and aggression, upsetting what they see as a delicate balance between Russia and Ukraine, which is undermining their efforts, the US efforts, to bring about a ceasefire. I mean, for what it's worth, I don't share that view. I think the idea that there is any balance or moral equivalence in this war is delusional and ultimately harmful to Western and US security.
Okay, but should we just try and pin down the legality? Because I think that might be a question a lot of people might be thinking about. I'm thinking about, because some of these things are quite grey and quite near the line, aren't they? What is the actual law of armed conflict when it comes to targeted killings? Are they legal or not? And Patrick, it's worth pointing out here that, I mean, you've been there. You have been the military authority to authorise precision strikes on individuals over several different jobs you've done in the army. So talk us through the legality from your own perspective, your own experience.
Yeah, so as you say, I've got a fair bit of personal experience on here. I mean, both on operations when I was commanding the UK task force in Afghanistan in Helm, and I, as the commander, was the senior officer, delegated the power to authorize strikes, deliberate strikes on enemy targets. And then after that, when I was director of operations in the Ministry of Defence, I ran the targeting boards for the Defence Secretary of the day.
Targeting boards?
So the process that you go through to authorize a strike on a target, and I'll talk you through it. And it's a really rigorous process to ensure that we comply with the law of armed conflict. Now, these targeting boards are run for pre-planned, deliberate operations, so ahead of time. There'll always be a formal minuted meeting, and its composition in this targeting board will include the target engagement authority, so the person who's authorized to take the decision. In my case in Afghanistan, that was me. In the case of running targeting boards, it was the Defense Secretary. There'll be an official or a military officer from Defense Intelligence providing the intelligence. There'll be what we call a targeteer, so someone who is expert in targeting. They can describe how the target will be struck, the effects on the target, the likely risks associated with it. There'll be a policy advisor, and there'll be a military lawyer with deep expertise in operational law and international humanitarian law.
And this is a huge amount of people involved in targeting just one individual and a massive amount of work.
But it's not just individuals. Sometimes you're striking infrastructure, you're striking enemy targets. But so whatever it is, whatever the target is, you will go through this process ahead of time.
The work behind it is intensive.
Oh, it is, yeah. For hasty or for dynamic targeting, so when you're getting fleeting targets, we rely on our training because every soldier has to take these decisions. And if you see an enemy pop up in front of you, you've got to work through a series of things in your mind. And what we do is use the training so that we develop what you might describe as a humanitarian reflex. Am I doing the right thing? Is this a legitimate target? Do I need to engage? Now, in every case, we consider the law of armed conflict. So I'm going to run through that for you so you can understand. So the first question you're establishing is this an international armed conflict? And that then tells you...
It needs to be that.
Yes. And then that tells you what the status is between combatants, those who were involved, and civilians who have protected status. Combatants are absolutely legitimate targets. You'll then turn to the law and you'll ask yourself three questions. So the first question is around distinction. Is this a military target? Is it a military objective? The second is proportionality. So will the attack cause excessive incidental civilian harm or damage compared to the anticipated military advantage? So it's about what you're anticipating because you can never know.
There's a phrase, collateral damage, isn't there?
There is. And you go through something called a collateral damage estimate. So you work out what the likely collateral damage will be, and you have to work out what the value of that target is.
Which is a really interesting point because that doesn't necessarily mean because there might be some collateral damage, aka some civilians might die, the operation isn't necessarily legal. Civilians may die as a result of a perfectly legal operation, and
exactly.
That doesn't make it illegal, to put it another way.
Exactly. And it's the difficult judgment of politicians and military commanders to work out where the value lies. So generally speaking, particularly for the operations we've been involved in over the last few years where we're targeting terrorists, we will keep the collateral damage estimation very low, very, very small numbers, and you try to make sure that no one else is killed. Like that, operation that you described earlier on with the scooter. 2 military targets killed, no civilians killed. But sometimes the value of the target, a munitions factory, means that some civilians who are working at the factory might die, obviously. And then the third question you ask under the law is around military necessity. So that means that these military actions have to be necessary to achieve a military objective, and you cannot cause unnecessary suffering. So if you met all of the criteria there, you can pre-authorize these attacks.
What's it actually like to do that in person? What does it feel like? So, for example, when you were commander of Task Force Helm and the brigadier in charge of the entire force in Helm and fighting a very bitter war, you would be asked to sign off a Hellfire missile strike from a Apache helicopter or drone on someone you're probably even looking at a visual feed on from a video on a drone. You're looking at this guy and you have life or death power over him.
Well, it's our job. We're combatants, and the reason that you will be pulling the trigger on that strike is because if you don't, one or more British soldiers or Allied soldiers or Afghan soldiers in that case would be killed because you hadn't. So there's no question about the legality or the legitimacy of what you're doing, but you're carrying a very, very heavy responsibility. And it's not something that, I tried never to let emotion get into it, and I never watched the Predator screens habitually. I forced myself to watch a few so I understood the weight, the moral consequences of what I was doing. It was not something to be done lightly. And it's true. That's not just true of me. Anybody who's involved in these decisions takes them extraordinarily seriously, and politicians do too. Every Secretary of State that I briefed felt the responsibility of taking these sort of decisions very heavily.
Okay, and we have absolutely no reason to believe whatsoever that Ukraine don't go through a very similar sort of structures, perhaps speed it up because there's so much more going on there. But bring this back to Major Gerstiev now. He who was blown up outside his flats by someone who may not have been someone he met on a dating site. He's a civilian, so that would suggest his killing might have been illegal. We're not going to sit in judgment here on Ukraine because we don't know all the facts, but it would suggest he might have been on the wrong side of the line if it was Ukraine, after all, who did it.
I mean, we don't know. As a civilian, and he was a civilian at the time, technically he had protected status. But if the Ukrainians had intelligence that he was playing an active role in the conflict, then he would have been a legitimate target. And there's another reason why we don't know these things. And that's because there are very, very, one of the most important things you have to do is to protect your operational security. So the Ukrainians will not be talking about these pre-planned targets, won't be talking about their techniques, won't be talking about why they're taking these decisions, because they have to protect the information that they have. They've got to maintain operational security.
It's just an absolutely fascinating area, and there's so much more we could go into in all of this. What do we conclude? Do we think that these sort of targeted killings help or hinder Ukraine's war efforts? So from a civilian perspective, I've learned a lot from you actually on this episode. There are obviously the downsides. I think we have to point this out. Illegal targets can sap your domestic and certainly international support. And it's not just when those operations become counterproductive and cross into the illegal. It also encourages the Russians, your enemy, to do something similar. For example, do horrendous things like going after the CEOs of Rheinmetall, obvious civilians who shouldn't be anywhere near this sort of war. So it sort of lowers the tone of the war, if you like. But I mean, for me, the upsides are pretty overwhelming. Powerful tool of asymmetric warfare, does real damage to the enemy, as you were explaining, either by losing personnel or making the lives considerably harder, and a great effect on the Ukrainian population at large. I mean, overall, they seem to be a pretty useful tool. Yeah. What's your conclusion?
There are no half measures in wartime. You have to fight with every means at your disposal. You just have to make sure that you're doing it within a framework that make sure that you're doing it legally and with legitimacy. So these are smart operations. These are exactly the sort of operations that you've seen historically being conducted, and that we, the Brits, and we, NATO, will be doing as well. We'd just be doing it within a really clear framework.
Okay, a fascinating discussion, fascinating episode, and a real insight for me, certainly, into that very shadowy, uncertain world. Do email us, generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. That's generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. And there we must wrap. Thank you very much, Patrick. See you next week.
Thanks, Tom.